Some people pass through your life like a breeze, gentle, fleeting, forgotten. But then there are those whose presence feels like a soul storm. They arrive not just to walk beside you, but to awaken something dormant within you. Time cannot erase them. Distance cannot dull their imprint, and silence only deepens the sound of their presence within you. When love is real, not born of ego, fantasy, or projection, it vibrates beyond physical form. It exists in memory, in dreams, in the way your body still reacts to a name you no longer say out loud. It's not that the person becomes your identity, it's that they mirror a piece of you that was waiting to be seen. A soul doesn't meet another by chance. It recognizes what the eyes do not see. Comment: I feel this true connection, if you believe this truth. There is something profoundly disorienting, and yet deeply familiar about meeting someone who feels like home, not in the way a place feels safe, but in the way a reflection reveals your hidden depth. According to Carl Jung, this kind of experience isn't just emotional, it's archetypal. When we encounter someone who stirs our soul, we are touching a force greater than personal history. Jung called this synchronicity the meaningful meeting of inner and outer worlds. You may think it's coincidence, but something in you knows it's not. You've dreamed them before you knew their name. You've felt their sorrow in your own chest. Because your connection is not of the surface, it is of the psyche. Love of this depth is not about possession or perfection. It's about resonance. It's about that moment when your shadows begin to rise in response to theirs. When you feel exposed, not by what they say, but by what they awaken. Jung believed we project the unintegrated parts of ourselves onto others, the shadow, the anima, the animus. So when you feel intense love or aversion, it's often not just about the other person, it's your unconscious calling you inward. That's why real love challenges. It doesn't just comfort, it confronts. It shows you who you are beneath who you pretend to be. But here's the sacred truth. If that bond is real, it doesn't fade. It changes form. Yes, it evolves. Maybe the two of you drift apart. Maybe the relationship cannot survive in the material world. But something remains, a tether, an echo, a knowing. That love is not undone by endings, it continues in silence. It matures in solitude, and sometimes the deeper work begins, not when you are together, but after you part. When the soul begins to process what the ego could not yet understand. To understand why certain bonds never fade, we must enter the invisible. Jung's teachings remind us that not all love is conscious. Much of it originates in the unconscious, the place where symbols live and destiny whispers. When two souls meet and awaken something ancient within each other, what they are truly encountering is the unspoken material of their own psyche. The intensity is not just about who the other is. It is about who we become in their presence. It is an alchemical reaction, a mirror held so close that it forces us to meet ourselves, raw and unrehearsed. That is why some connections feel like spiritual earthquakes. They do not just offer comfort, they trigger remembrance. When the anima or animus is projected, we don't merely fall in love with another, we fall in love with our own potential. The woman sees the strength she has disowned in herself and calls it him. The man sees the softness he longs for and calls it her. But this illusion, beautiful as it may be, cannot last. Over time, the real person emerges, and with it, the disappointment of unmet fantasy. Yet this unraveling is sacred, because beyond the illusion lies truth, not just about them, but about you. Jung believed that when these projections collapse, we are given a choice. Return to fantasy or begin the hard work of integration. This is where most love stories end, at the point of disillusionment. But real soul bonds are not so easily undone, because even when the projection dissolves, The deeper thread remains. You may no longer speak. You may have parted ways. But the internal work they sparked within you continues. The dreams, the triggers, the memories, they are not remnants of heartbreak. They are proof that the connection was never meant to stay on the surface. It came to shape your evolution. Even in absence, the bond evolves. The love shifts from outer form to inner symbol, and symbols, Jung taught, are eternal. So if someone lives inside you long after they've left your life, don't rush to label it as attachment or weakness. Sometimes it is a sacred echo, a reminder from the unconscious that something real was touched. Not every soul we meet is meant to walk with us forever, but some are meant to awaken us forever. That's why the love doesn't die, because what it revealed is still alive in you. There is a moment, often in solitude, when the realization arrives quietly, they changed me, not through words or promises, but through presence, through the way their soul activated something ancient within yours. Even if the mind tries to move on, the soul resists, not out of longing, but because it recognizes something eternal. Carl Jung taught that the soul speaks in images, in symbols, in dreams, and when someone appears in your inner world, long after they've left your outer one, that's not just memory, that's meaning. The psyche holds on to what matters, not because it cannot let go, but because something deeper has yet to complete its cycle. The most powerful connections aren't always the most peaceful. They often come with disruption, confusion, and intensity. This is the nature of archetypal love. It unsettles the ego to awaken the self. You may feel drawn to someone in ways you cannot explain. You may feel pain without betrayal, longing without contact. This is not madness. This is soul work. Jung called these moments initiations, psychic thresholds we must cross to become more whole. And the other person, whether they know it or not, becomes the vessel through which your unconscious begins to speak. What remains after they are gone is not a ghost, it's a guide. The lingering energy is not a trap, it's a teaching. If you look deeply, you'll notice the shifts. Maybe you started setting boundaries because of what the relationship revealed. Maybe you found your voice in the silence they left behind. Maybe you finally saw your patterns in the way they mirrored them back to you. This is the paradox. Even when they leave, their soul stays, not to haunt, but to help. Because your encounter was never just about romance. It was about your return to yourself. And that's the truth few speak aloud. Some loves do not fade because they were never meant to be ordinary. They were initiatory, transformational, alchemical. You don't get over these bonds. You grow through them, and eventually you realize they didn't stay in your life, but they stayed in your evolution. And perhaps that was the point all along. The soul does not count time as the mind does. It moves in cycles, not calendars. And some soul connections continue long after the story has ended on the surface. You might find yourself healing 5 years later from a wound you didn't know was still open. You might stumble upon their voice in a song, their energy in a dream, their lesson in the silence between breaths. That is because the love was not of the mind, it was archetypal. It touched the inner terrain that Carl Jung described as the collective unconscious, a realm beneath the personal where timeless forces live. In this sacred space, some people are not just people, they are symbols, they are messengers, they are the hands of destiny gently shaking you awake. When love reaches this depth, it does not demand presence to stay alive. It doesn't fade with the absence of text messages or the loss of shared routines, because its real purpose was never about daily companionship. It was about awakening the buried layers of your psyche, that ache you feel, that sudden pull toward meaning. That is not grief. It is initiation. You are being asked to walk the inner path now, to carry what they revealed, and to become who you were meant to be. The bond remains not because they are unfinished, but because you are still unfolding. Some connections serve as thresholds. They arrive at the intersection of endings and beginnings, love and loss, ego and soul. They are not meant to last in the ordinary sense. They are meant to transform you. You may resist that truth. You may long for permanence. But true soul love is never about possession. It is about permission. Permission to evolve. Permission to feel. Permission to remember who you were before the world told you to forget. This kind of love does not cage the heart. It breaks it open, so that something more honest can rise from within. And when it does, you will understand that bond wasn't meant to be a story that made sense. It was meant to be a chapter that made you whole. Real love leaves marks, not scars of pain, but symbols of purpose, and those marks become maps. Maps that lead you inward, maps that remind you again and again. Some people were not meant to stay, but they were always meant to awaken. Sometimes, when you least expect it, the memory returns, not just a mental image, but a feeling that floods your entire being. Their name drifts through your mind like a whisper. A forgotten scent stirs something ancient. A phrase they once said lands with new weight. This is not obsession, it is not weakness, it is soul recall. According to Jung, the unconscious stores more than memory. It stores meaning. And certain people, especially those who trigger our deepest archetypes, do not vanish when the relationship ends. They live within the symbolic structures of the psyche, animating dreams, desires, and revelations long after they're gone. This is why closure is not always possible in the way we want it. The ego craves answers. The soul craves integration. And sometimes integration takes years or lifetimes. You may outgrow the pain, but not the wisdom. You may forget their voice, but not what it stirred. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, is often catalyzed by the very relationships that break us open. What begins as longing, confusion, or heartbreak becomes a path toward inner unity. The other is no longer outside of us, but within, as a teacher, a mirror, a symbol of the unlived self. That is the quiet miracle of real love. It lingers, but not to torture. It lingers to guide. When you begin to reflect, you'll see it was never really about them. It was about the way they cracked you open. The way they challenged your illusions. The way they reminded you of a truth you forgot you carried. Love, at its highest, is not about merging with another. It is about remembering yourself through them. Their presence, even in absence, becomes a compass, not pointing to them, but to your soul's own expansion. So if you still feel them, honor that. If your heart still reacts, don't shame it. Love that touches the soul is not something you walk away from like a chapter in a book. It becomes the ink with which the next chapter is written. That is not a failure, that is grace. Because love that transforms is never wasted. It doesn't end, it becomes. If you've made it this far, perhaps it's because a part of you has lived this truth. Perhaps there is someone who, even in their absence, continues to awaken something sacred inside of you. And maybe, just maybe, that bond was never meant to be resolved, only revealed. Carl Jung taught that the soul has its own logic, one that transcends time, identity, and separation. When you truly connect with someone at the level of being, that connection becomes mythic, not in fantasy, but in meaning. They become more than a person, they become a symbol of what your spirit was ready to confront, remember, and reclaim. This is why real love doesn't fade. Not because of unfinished business, but because of unfinished becoming. The relationship may be over, but the work it began in your psyche continues. The healing, the awakening, the inner integration. These things move slowly, like moonlight over water. quiet but profound. The soul takes its time with what matters most. And if their presence still lives within you, it's not because you haven't let go, it's because the lesson, the reflection, the transformation is still unfolding. So let your heart stop asking, why do I still feel this? Instead ask, what is this still teaching me? Love like this is not bound to form. It transcends beginnings and endings. It teaches us to sit in the space between, to honor the bond without clinging to the past, to carry the essence without needing the form, to let the imprint become insight, to let the pain become power, and to let the echo become a song that guides you inward toward your own wholeness. Because when love is real, it never asks to be held tightly. It asks to be understood. And once understood, it doesn't need to be chased. It becomes a quiet light inside of you, a reminder that your soul is not broken, it is blooming. That bond, however mysterious, was not a detour. It was part of the design. And maybe that's the deepest truth of all. Some people don't return to our lives because their purpose was to return us to ourselves. If you've made it this far, drop a 100 in the comments. It shows you are part of the 1% that's improving every single day.